Well, I can start by talking about myself. So obviously I'm going to be talking about protected cropping in subtropical climates, and also going to just give you a brief overview of the Australian medicinal cannabis industry. So I'm not your typical Nuffield farming scholar, because I identify as a research scientist first and a farmer second. So I've got a Bachelor of Science and Honours in Horticulture from the University of the Sunshine Coast. I've been working in ornamental horticulture for almost 10 years now, which has included the floriculture industry and the nursery industry as well. So a highlight of my career has actually been the development of the Australian native umbrella fern, which, now I'm going to be able to show you a picture. Okay, so just up in the top right is the Australian native umbrella fern, which is a very unique and niche high-value cut foliage export product, which is very popular in all the export floriculture markets, which we are now starting to see a little bit more in our Australian markets as well. But as you probably all know, not many of you probably buy flowers, but I encourage you to buy more flowers. Never underestimate the power of a bunch of flowers. So prior to my research, there was no method to propagate this highly valuable species. It was just wild harvested. So very important for continuity of supply and to be sustainable to actually bring this under artificial cultivation. So I've been working on that since 2009, and I'm happy to say it's now under artificial cultivation at 2 locations, one on the Sunshine Coast and the other in the Mary Valley, both in southeast Queensland. Prior to embarking on my Nuffield journey, I was also a lecturer in scientific research methods at the University of the Sunshine Coast, and as all the scholars in the room will identify with, it's pretty hard to be teaching for a semester when you've got to travel overseas all the time, so I've taken a break from that. I also have, just on the side, I do a little bit of private consultancy work across horticulture, because as we all know in this industry, there's a lot of research potential out there, but sometimes as farmers we don't know exactly how to go about that, so I can help a bit with that. And of course, when I'm not working, I'm at home with my 2 sons in Mapleton Forest up on the Blackall Range. So I'm going to talk about protected cropping and how this relates to feeding the world in 2050. So protected cropping refers to crops that are grown in a managed environment that are protected from the natural elements. So what does this have to do with feeding the world in 2050? Well, we're going to look at climate change, increased climate variability. We're also looking at global populations that are projected to reach 9.8 billion by 2050. So 90%, so global food, fibre and feed demand is expected to increase by 70% by 2050. 90% of that increase is expected to come from crop intensity and higher yields. So only 10% of that is coming from land expansion. So what this means is we need to produce more food with less resources, less land, less water, less access to labour, less resources in general. So, and as I mentioned before, we have to do this in the face of the unknown effects of climate change and increased climate variability. But luckily, protected cropping is offering a sustainable and adaptive approach for us to deal with this challenge, and we've got a variety of technologies that are available. So in my research, I looked at the following 6 objectives. So I went out to look at the different variety of structures and technology that was currently being used in subtropical climates. I looked at the specific challenges that are related to subtropical climates, and then I ended up determining some of the barriers to adoption in those regions that I visited. So like yarn, I went out looking for, the high tech, the bells and whistles. I wanted to see the latest and the greatest. And when I got to Italy and Spain, I realised people were really quite low tech in a lot of those areas. And so I really changed my topic a little bit to look at the barriers to adoption. So I identified new and emerging technology. And then I also came across forest farming as an effective form of low tech, or what I'm coining a zero tech form of protected cropping. And then of course, because I like new things, I've worked a lot with native plants. I threw a curveball in there because I wanted to identify any potential new or underutilised crop species, which is quite difficult to go searching for, I can tell you that. So I was focusing on subtropical climates. So we've had a bit of a talk about climatic conditions and different regions. Sorry, they've just changed my screen on me. So the subtropical climates are located between the tropics and the temperate zone, and they have very unique climatic conditions. So obviously when we're looking at protected cropping for subtropical climates, our conditions and our challenges are quite different to something in the temperate regions. So what we're looking at is reducing the light intensity. We've got too much solar radiation. Often we need to shade those plants in the winter months, whereas in temperate regions it's the opposite. They're needing supplemental lighting, they're needing heating. So it's quite a different environment that we need to manage that microclimate. So the subtropical climate is actually then divided into two subcategories, which is the humid subtropical climate and the Mediterranean or dry summer climate. So typically, most people are familiar with the humid subtropical climate, which tends to be located on the eastern side of subtropical continents. And it's characterised by our wet summers and our dry winters. The Mediterranean or dry summer climate is the opposite of that, typically located on the western side of subtropical continents as well as along the Mediterranean Sea. And it's characterised by having their rainfall concentrated in the winter months, and they have dry summers. So two unique categories within the subtropics. So I visited a variety of different countries that you can see up there. So the yellow region is the subtropics. So I visited countries that related to both of the subgroups, and I also visited Costa Rica just to see some of the challenges that they were experiencing in the tropics, and they were also a really good country to visit in regards to forest farming, which I will get to. So I was also lucky to visit the International Symposium on Tropical and Temperate Horticulture up in Cairns, which gave me a great number of contacts for me to visit during my travels. So there's numerous benefits to protected cropping. So obviously the number one is being able to manipulate the growing climate. So this leads to increased yields, improved product quality, extending your growing season, increasing your harvesting window. It allows for year-round production. And as Jan gave some examples of just how it benefited him from going from outdoors to the protected cropping space. So we can also protect from adverse weather events, which means we can have continuity of supply. So I've visited some growers in Florida that I know after Irma came through last week or the week before, they will still be in production because of the facilities that they invested in. And of course, it also allows for us to reduce pest pressures, and by managing the microclimate and providing those ideal conditions, we can also reduce the disease pressures. So there are a number of types of protected cropping. We've got a variety of structures that you saw on one of Jan's slides. There's different coverings. There's a variety of associated technologies with those. And then we can get various levels of control over our climate depending on how much we invest in those structures and the technology. And basically, you know, the higher the level of sophistication, the higher capital you need to invest, but then the higher return you're going to get if you can manage that space correctly. So protected cropping is broadly broken down into three categories. You've got your low tech, which is your basic shade houses and polytunnels. Medium tech start to get a bit more sophisticated and a little bit more control over the microclimate and more sophisticated coverings. And then you've got your high tech, which generally tend to be glass houses, highly sophisticated and computerized control systems. So as I mentioned before, during my travels, I actually stumbled across what I'm calling a fourth or a natural form of protected cropping, which I guess in looking at low medium tech, I'm bringing this in as a zero tech form of protected cropping. So this is where farmers are cultivating high value specialty crops under the canopy, under the protection of a modified forest canopy. So this can be done by thinning and pruning or adding trees to manipulate the amount of light that is reaching the understory. And obviously you've got significantly reduced capital investment from this form of farming. So it's been demonstrated as a profitable and sustainable land use system. It's really good for biodiversity, improving soil qualities, even carbon sequestration. It's particularly important for our developing nations and our low socioeconomic areas. So for that 70% increase in production that we need to achieve by 2050, 80% of that is expected to come from developing nations. So they're not going to be able to invest in the latest and greatest high-tech protected cropping facilities and technologies. So I think it's important that we look at forest farming, and I saw a lot of this in Costa Rica. So it allows for income security through diversification. You can plant a canopy crop for timber harvest, for example, but I did also see in Florida, I saw people growing high-value foliage crops under existing live oak ecosystems. So they weren't actually paying anything for their form of protected cropping. They were just using the existing stands of trees, which is really great for maintaining forest integrity and great when you're looking at the future and the effects of climate change. So I saw a lot of different new technologies during my travels. So Technova in Almeria in Spain was looking at a lot of advancing the covering, so looking at different additives to increase the lifespan. And if you don't know much about Almeria in Spain, there are so many greenhouses, which are mainly polytunnels there, that you can actually see them from space. A lot of low-tech growing happening there, but there's a lot of research happening as well. Unfortunately, with a lot of these new coverings in polyethylene and polycarbonate, a lot of them were actually cost prohibitive. So although they were extending the lifespan, it actually wasn't currently worth it for the growers to invest that little bit more, but hopefully, you know, their research will keep going. They were also looking at different structures, increasing the height, and looking at a lot more technology as well. Photovoltaic glass is a really interesting space. So I did see PV glass installed in a greenhouse in China. One of the concerns they had, however, as you can see from the image, is that it actually intercepts a lot of the light. So there's actually a great group at the Edith Cowan University as part of Esri in Perth that has actually been the first to develop clear photovoltaic glass. So they're looking at, I think, the light interception of only 30%, so 70% is making it to the crop. And this is exciting for horticulture, but is also being picked up in the building industry. So we're going to see buildings being built now in our cities that are also going to have this technology to be generating electricity. And with the high costs of heating and cooling of our greenhouses, this is going to be really important in the horticultural space. And it's great to see Australia leading the way with that research. So I also looked at cyclone-proof structures, and it's unfortunate that Ross couldn't be here today because he also looked at these structures. So if you are interested, I suggest you look out for his report when it comes out, because he's got a huge section on Cravo, which are the retractable roof structures. So I visited people in Florida that invested in Cravos after a hurricane in 2004 and 2005 decimated their nursery, and so they'd used their insurance money to invest in a Cravo. Probably couldn't have done it otherwise, but they've actually engineered this structure because they're in a high-risk zone to be able to withstand winds of over 200 kilometres per hour. BW Global is a Canadian company, and they're looking at 100% closed systems that also have a hail guarantee and a hurricane guarantee that are built to withstand winds of 130 kilometres an hour, which is quite important for our friends in Florida at the moment. So I saw a variety of technologies relating to improving climate control. So Israel, an amazing nation, they do call it the startup nation, and I wish I could have spent some more time there and hope to get back there. So I saw a variety of technology there. One of them in particular that I thought was of interest included this roots technology, which was looking at soil temperature regulation. So instead of heating the air of the greenhouse, heating the roots. So they were using ground source heat exchange technology, where you can see they were sinking these huge coils in the earth to a depth over 5 metres. And so they were just running water through these pipes and then circulating it along where the roots of the crop were. And depending on the crop, depended on how many pipes they would run past the roots and at what depth. And so this was, at the moment, showing great yield increases, anywhere from 20 to 140%. They do have some records of 400%, but they don't like to say that because they think people will just think they're pulling their leg if they say that they had that much increase in yield. But also on the side of that, increasing product size, quality, reducing time to harvest, and of course extending that growing season, and at only 20% of the operational cost to traditional heating methods. So they're actually looking at coming to Australia as well, hopefully next year, so hopefully we'll start to see them here. The same company, Rootsat in Israel, is also looking at irrigation by condensation, which I think is a great idea for in our subtropical climates when we've got high humidity. So this one actually cools the liquid in pipes to below dew point and then runs it past the root system, either just below the soil surface or on the soil surface, and you're actually irrigating the crop by condensing the moisture out of the air. So I think this is a pretty exciting space as well, but that one's still in the R&D phase. Again, in Israel, the Volcani Research Centre has developed this standalone dehumidifier called DryGer, which is also actually able to control the temperature. And again, significant energy savings. We reduce all the clutter of having heated pipes running through the greenhouses as well. And so by dehumidifying with this unit, you don't have to open the vents, which means you are keeping the warmer air in during the cooler months, and you're preventing the loss of precious carbon dioxide as well. And it actually distributes the warm air directly above the crop, so it's a more efficient method. Something a little bit different I saw in Florida is a new soilless media called hydrofiber. So it's developed from the southern pine. So they're really just trying to reduce the reliance on non-renewable substrates such as peat and perlite, similar to Koya, but this one's being developed in the US. And I saw a few nurseries that have actually moved to use trialling this alongside Koya to have a look at how it compares. So again, a really interesting space. So with all these great technologies, what are the barriers to adoption? When I first left, I was expecting to see the latest and the greatest, and I didn't. Some countries I did, and then down the road you had quite low tech structures. So of course the number one barrier is the economical investment. So the capital investment is huge for these high-tech structures and associated technologies. We've then got the operational costs. If you're heating and cooling, we all know the price of electricity just keeps going up. So operational costs are also inhibitive to expanding into the high-tech space. We've then got concerns with repair and maintenance. So when you've got all these high-tech computerized programs, if things go wrong, they're expensive to repair. If you have a hailstorm that then comes through and damages your structure, that's going to be very expensive to repair. And then if the value of the crop is not high enough, why would you be investing in a high-tech or even a medium-tech structure? One of the barriers that I wasn't expecting to come across was actually the social barriers. And again, this was also when I was in Italy and Spain, and there were a lot of smaller operations, family-run operations. And so this was really related to the ownership models, the size of the operation, the level of education and the age of management, and then the level of, at what stage of succession that operation was in. So I met a lot of families where, the son or daughter that wanted to, that was next in line was just waiting respectfully on the sideline, waiting for dad to give them the go-ahead, and then they had all these great ideas they wanted to try, but they weren't going to try it until it was their turn to take over. Another one of the biggest barriers to adoption, which I wasn't actually expecting, was the environmental concerns. So there are a lot of growers out there that don't want to invest in the higher tech because it's going to be a lot more expensive to repair when something goes wrong. So being in subtropical climates, whether you're in Florida with the hurricanes, we get cyclones up in Queensland, or across in Queensland, sorry, from here. So we've got increasing extreme weather events. We've got the unknown effects of climate change. We're already seeing increasing climate variability. And unfortunately, structural damage is a key concern when you're investing in these structures. And it's quite unfortunate, this farm that you can see on the bottom, the picture on the bottom right is from Hurricane Matthew 11 months ago. And I visited just in January, and they still weren't able to repair because it had hit so many of the farmers in the area. They had a shortage on shade cloth. This particular farm is involved in floriculture, so then they couldn't actually repair because they risked damaging their crop that they needed for Valentine's Day. Unfortunately, the next two photos is from Hurricane Irma just a couple of weeks ago. You probably couldn't tell the difference, that they were from a different date. One of the concerns that this farmer did discuss with me was in regards to insurance. So they don't have crop insurance, but they have the insurance for their structure. And they are quite concerned when I visited them in January that they wouldn't be able to get insurance for much longer because of the high payouts. Now they've just had their second claim in 11 months. So unfortunately, this industry in Florida may not have this option, or will not be able to afford the option of having that structural insurance, especially as at the moment, I think it's slightly gone off track, but they had Hurricane Maria tracking towards them last week. Luckily, it's going a little bit off the coast, but still they're going to have high winds that can cause this damage. And of course you can see the effects of a hailstorm on a glass house there as well. So this is a key barrier to adoption of these technologies. So of course we've got the unknown effects of climate change. We've got climate variability happening right now, whether any of us agree with whether global warming is happening, we are seeing increased climate variability. As we know as farmers, our production is vulnerable to the climatic conditions, so we are not immune to what is happening. We are already seeing increases to global mean surface temperatures, and they're predicted at almost between 2 and 4% by 2100, and that's a conservative estimate. I've just come back from South Africa, which is a Mediterranean dry summer climate. The research that they're doing there is showing that the Mediterranean subtropical regions are going to experience double the surface temperature increase to the rest of the world. They're also shown in their research they're going to have reduced rainfall. So if the world is experiencing a 2 degrees increase, those areas are experiencing a 4-degree increase and reduced rainfall. So we've got big concerns across the world of how we are going to produce crops to feed the population now and all the way to 2050 and beyond. So we've got increased climate variability. We've got the unknown effects of climate change as an additional challenge. But we do have protected cropping as an effective adaptation strategy, so that we can use this so that we don't have significant impacts to food security both now and in the future. So some of the future opportunities, as I said, protected cropping is going to be the least affected by climate change and increased climate variability. It really does offer us the potential to grow any crop, anywhere, anytime, if we can afford the capital investment. So although the high-tech structures and associated technologies are going to be the best to have the highest yields and the best quality, they've also got the highest capital investment, so they are not the only answer. So we need to invest in the low and medium tech, especially for our developing countries and our low socio-economic areas, and that's where forest farming also has a key role to play. We need to be developing energy and emissions efficient systems, because with the rising cost of electricity, we need to get better at being able to manage that microclimate within the greenhouse and lower the cost of the technology and infrastructure so more people can adopt these technologies. So my recommendations, probably as a research scientist, it's no surprise we need more R&D. So we need more R&D across all levels, not just the high tech. We need the low and the medium tech and the forest farming. So we need to look at crop compatibility in particular when it comes to forest farming. We need to then promote these new innovations through education and technology transfer. And Nuffield and conferences like these are a perfect platform in order to do that. So we also need to provide incentives for farmers and the private sector to get on board as well, because we can't just leave it up to the scientists, which don't always communicate so well, back to the farmers. And I try and keep a leg in one foot in the academia world and 1 foot in the industry. And I tell you, it's an interesting juggling act. But we need better communication and better technology transfer and education across all levels. And then my fifth recommendation comes back to my curveball objective of trying to find new or underutilised crop species that would be suitable for cultivation in Australia. So the Australian medicinal cannabis industry is a very new industry, and I'm assuming most of you have heard maybe a little bit about this, some more than others. So on the 29th of February last year, the Australian Parliament passed legislation that allowed cannabis to be treated as a medicine in Australia. So prior to this, you couldn't get access to it. This actually came into effect on the 30th of October in 2016. Unfortunately, to date, I think we've only got 160 patients in Australia that have actually been able to get through all the paperwork with their doctor to actually get a prescription through the special access scheme. But hopefully with more education and advances in the industry, this is going to change. From the farming perspective, there are a lot of licensing requirements to get into the industry. So it is heavily regulated at the state and federal level. We've got the Therapeutics Goods Administration and the Office of Drug Control that are heavily regulating this industry. There are 3 forms of licences. There's the medical cannabis licence, which is really about cultivation and production. There's the research licence, pretty self-explanatory, and then the manufacturing licence, which is needed to actually develop that raw material into a saleable product, which can actually be the flower, but you do need that manufacturer licence to be able to sell it as a product. So besides all the paperwork that's involved in these licences, you also have to pass a fit and proper persons test, which is an interesting one for the industry. Hopefully this is going to become easier for people to get involved in the industry once we have a few of those leading groups that are going through. So currently 17 licences have been granted, 8 of them are in cultivation and production, 5 research and 4 manufacture. But I will just let you know that the licence actually doesn't give you the permit to start. So the licence is what you get first and then you get a permit. So a little bit difficult to get started, but a very interesting space, because Australia is really well placed for cultivating medicinal cannabis. We've got a much better growing climate than some of our friends up in Canada, for example. So I was able to visit a facility actually as part of my GFP, where it was all grown indoors, all artificial lighting. It was actually aquaponics, so it was quite fascinating. But we don't need to bring it indoors. It doesn't snow in most of Australia for most of the year, so we don't need to worry about those kind of concerns. We can use natural light. We can reduce our carbon footprint because we don't need to use artificial lighting. It is one way, for the full production, we can just use it as supplemental lighting. So the local Australian market is conservatively estimated at being valued at $100 million per year, but we're really not sure where this is going to go. The global industry, as I'm sure you've all heard a bit about, is valued at $200 billion, and 50% of that is related to medicinal. So it's important that Australia really starts to think about, and the government is thinking about this now, as where we can sit with our export potential. Keeping in mind that Australia would only be able to export for medicinal purposes, not for recreational purposes, but we do have a huge future export market potential. Currently 29 countries recognise medicinal cannabis in some form, and Canada and the Netherlands are the only 2 countries at the moment that are allowed to export. Israel are moving towards this at the moment. They've got most of the medical research is coming out of Israel, whereas Canada really have that first mover advantage and are really trying to monopolise the world market. So I think it's important that Australia starts to act now. So just for example, some of the new markets that are coming online, Germany just made medicinal cannabis legal in March, and they're actually providing national health coverage for medical cannabis. So they're predicting that this industry is going to be double the size of Canada. And if you haven't heard in the news, Canada's actually legalising recreational cannabis on the 1st of July next year. So there's a huge shift all around the world in regards to the legislation and the legal requirements around cannabis for recreational and for medicinal purposes. And I think it's just a really exciting space. I never thought I would find something that would be, of such high value and so important for Australia. During my Nuffield travels, I actually almost changed my topic. Luckily I didn't, because anywhere I got my foot in the door, it was non-disclosure agreements, confidentiality agreements, no photos, no passing on the information. So lucky I didn't change my topic and I stuck with protected cropping. So I just would like to thank Horticulture Innovation Australia and the Viertel Charitable Foundation as my sponsors for my scholarship. Couldn't have done it without them. I had great support from my company, Cedar Hill Corporate Group and Premium Greens Australia. But of course, without my family at home, Lee, Kaylin and Hewan, I definitely couldn't have done it. So thanks to all these people for making it possible, and thanks for coming.